Okay, some great questions here. Is Mary's role in salvation history shown in any way through the concept of the marital covenant? Since covenant is a major aspect of God's relation to us. That's a great question. So obviously the answer is yes. And we see that in the fact that Mary is the new Eve. Right? Her role is obviously intimately connected with the marital covenant and how that reveals God's relationship to mankind. And the fact that the marital covenant reveals God's relationship to us, it's shown in many places in the Bible. A beautiful place is Ephesians chapter 5. One second. Ephesians chapter 5 speaks of marriage as a sacrament, that is, as the great sacrament. Just one second. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one. This is a great mystery, and I mean in reference to Christ and the church. And so, marriage, although founded right at the beginning of time, was right from the beginning meant to be a sacrament, meaning a sacred sign of God's relationship to mankind that culminates in Christ's wedding with His church. And so Christ's matrimony with the church is figured in every marriage. Right? And that's why marriage is such a sacred, well, it's one of the reasons why marriage is such a sacred thing. That it's the image of of Christ's wedding with mankind in Holy Mother Church. Now, so the bridegroom in every marriage represents Christ, and the bride represents the church. Right? Now, Mary and the church go together because she's the icon of the church. She's the great image of everything that the church should be: virgin and mother, completely faithful, immaculate. And so Mary is, she's the mother of the church, she's the icon of the church, the exemplar of the church, and therefore the bride represents Our Lady in marriage, and the bridegroom, Christ. And so Mary's role in salvation history is, she's the perfect, God created mankind precisely to enter into a spousal relationship with mankind. And who is the creature who's most perfectly realized that plan of God in creation? Mary, right? She's the most perfect response on creation's side to God's initiative in creation. Right? She's the perfect bride. And so that's the reason why she's the mother of the church, because the church is meant to be a response to God's spousal love like that of Mary. And insofar as we do respond, well, then Christ is born in us. In other words, we become brides like Mary to the extent that we get more and more fully incorporated into the church and live her life. Right? We're all called to be virgin and mother, giving Christ's birth in our own life and in those with whom we have contact. Right? That's our to bring Christ to be born in our neighbor. And so Mary's the perfect image of mankind's response to God. Right? And so it's bridal, Mary's role. Right? The church is Petrine. The church is based on Peter. But the church is Marian even more so, right? Because she's the model and the mother. Right? It's a great. I'm sure there's much more to say. How do we know that Eve was a virgin when she was seduced by the serpent? well, it's not. It's true. It doesn't. The text doesn't directly state that, but it's clear that. Well, I think it does actually. When it's only after they leave the garden that it's told to us that Adam knew his wife, and so Adam knows his wife in Genesis 4, and Cain is the fruit of that. Right? And so Eve was a virgin when she was seduced by the serpent. They didn't have relations in the garden. It would have been part of God's plan for them to have relations in the garden. But the fall happened before. Right? And so all relations took place in our fallen state. Did St. Augustine or another church father teach that the original sin was that Adam and Eve had intercourse? No, absolutely not. I haven't read every text of St. Augustine and the Fathers, but that's not the patristic understanding of the original sin, nor is it the understanding of the Church. Right? It wasn't in any way, in any sense, a carnal sin. And the reason for this is because they didn't yet have original sin. See, Adam and Eve had a preternatural gift that we don't have, and we call that integrity. And that preternatural gift meant that Adam and Eve didn't feel unruly impulses of passion. We call that concupiscence in the technical sense. Concupiscence is the fact that we, before we deliberate, before we can, put a clamp on it, our sense appetites, our libido, has movements of its own that are contrary to reason. It's not a sin as long as we don't act on it. No? But that disorderly movement in us, Adam and Eve didn't have, because they were created in a better state. That's precisely a key part of the original justice in which God made Adam and Eve. They didn't feel that disordered desire. And therefore, their sin couldn't have been one of carnal weakness, as we so often experience. And this is very important. Their sin was worse. It was much graver than that. Far graver, far more significant. Right? The sin of Eve first, and then Adam, was the devil tempts Eve to be like God in a way that we're not meant to be. Right? Of course, it's good for us to want to be like God, to imitate God insofar as we can. But the temptation was to be like Him in knowing good and evil. And what that means, really, in the biblical context, is having dominion over good and evil. In other words, deciding for themselves good and evil. In other words, to be morally autonomous, to be our own makers, and to determine for ourselves good and evil. And that's the sin of the modern world, isn't it? That's the perennial temptation of mankind, to say, you're not the boss in my life. It ultimately comes down to this: no trespassing, stay out. In other words, I'm the one who determines here good and evil. Right? And so Adam and Eve's sin was really to want to be their own moral law, and not to be subordinate to God. And so it was much graver than simply having a sin of weakness and intercourse or something like that. So, and that's not what the Fathers teach. This opinion was widespread among Catholics of the World War II generation. Well, there's lots of ignorance out there everywhere, and so that's why we need to steady, our faith, and to. So the sin, and this is taught very beautifully by John Paul II in various places. He teaches it in Veritatis Splendor, his encyclical on the moral life, the sin of Adam and Eve, and it's how he introduces the second part of the encyclical, which is precisely dealing with problems in moral theology in the last 40 years. Right? What's the fundamental problem in moral theology in our time? We want to decide for ourselves good and evil, and we don't want to accept that there are moral absolutes, right? That there are universally binding moral norms. And thus we're repeating the sin of Adam and Eve. And that's why Mary is the counter Eve, right? Her yes to God is, Mary is the absolute opposite of wanting moral autonomy, of wanting to be autonomous with regard to God. Right? So she's That's why she's our mother, the mother of the church. It's because she is the one who forms us in that loving faith and obedience to God's word. That's fruitful, right? And so that attitude of wanting to be mortally autonomous brought forth death, right? That was the fruit of original sin. And Mary's faithful obedience is what brought forth Christ and life. Okay, another question. How do we know that Mary had never seen any sign of a miracle in her 30 years with Jesus? Well, we don't know. I mean, the gospel doesn't speak about that. But the very fact that John says this was his first sign that he worked leads us to think that it wasn't the first. I mean, that's the obvious reading of the text, is that he didn't do any before that. It's interesting, they're non-canonical gospels. We call them the Gnostic Gospels, that aren't true gospels. They were written by heretics in the 2nd century, and it's lately become all the fashion to cite these texts and to think that they're better than the true gospels. But of course, they're not. And if you actually read them, they're full of implausible things. And one of the interesting things that you find in these Gnostic Gospels is they tell about miracles of the baby Jesus. And obviously they're just made up. But the miracles, for example, some go like this, that he would make little birds out of clay, and then he would say, fly, and they would fly away. Or there was a story of somebody one of his playmates who fell off a roof, and Jesus resurrected him. And then the worst is in the carpenter shop, Joseph made a table with one of the legs too long, and Jesus kind of just pulled it and came out right. Anyway, we don't believe that these things happened, because they would be gratuitous miracles. Jesus never worked miracles just for the fun of it. Right? In other words, he never made use of his omnipotence for any personal motive. And that was precisely the first temptation of the devil in his 40 days in the desert, was to do a miracle to make the stones into bread for his benefit. No? And he says no.
And also that phrase where it says, is this not the son of Joseph? I mean, he's a pretty ordinary, common kid.
Right.
You know?
Right. He'd never done. Right. Right. That was part of his self-emptying, is that he led such a normal life that the people were astounded when he first began to teach in the synagogue in Nazareth. And so astounded that they tried to kill him. Are you aware of any concerns the Eastern Orthodox might have to new Marian dogmas? I'm afraid I'm totally ignorant about this. I wish I weren't, but some of their titles for Mary are very extravagant. Our Lady more spacious than the heavens. That's a beautiful title, by the way, because her womb contained the Creator of heaven and earth. And so for her womb to be, she is more spacious than the heavens. Right? Her womb contained the Creator of the heavens, even when he was just an embryo. The Eastern Church has a stupendous love for Our Lady, right? And is very Marian devotion is deeply present because it was the common patrimony of both East and West in the Church. Right?
The last question about some of the Gnostic stories about Jesus. It's funny that some of those heretical strains passed through Muhammad into the Quran. He was speaking as a baby. But they have the story of the clay bird.
Right.
And even my mother, who probably never knew Muslim in her life or even had a clue that it existed, she told me that story when I was a child. So it's funny how those stories are preserved. Right.
Yeah, Muhammad was very much in contact with heretical strains of Christianity, and that was one of the key elements in the formation of the Quran. He's very much influenced by Gnosticism. He has the idea that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, that it was just an appearance. Okay. But as far as the question goes, I'm afraid I can't answer. I don't know what their views are on Mary's media.
The dogmas already. They say one is the fatal Luminon, but it's hilarious that while they claim to reject the Assumption and call it the Dormition, here we have Assumption Greek Orthodox Church right here in West County. So that's one they may have less trouble with, but the Immaculate Conception they absolutely reject.
No, but see, the Immaculate Conception goes way back to the earliest centuries. So even though the doctrine was just defined in the 19th century, the idea of an immaculate conception we find in the idea that she's the new Eve. Right? Mary as the new Eve implies the immaculate conception, because to really be a counter Eve, a new start, Mary would have to start in the same way that Eve started, immaculate.
The rejection couldn't have been that rigid, or else how could the Eastern Orthodox Cambridge meeting with us at Florence for our
Right.
account? How could they possibly have overcome those rejections that
Right.
were very strong back then?
Right. The church has a life, it has a development, but the seeds are all present at the beginning. Right? And it's just a matter of slowly over the centuries drawing out more and more implications of what we've believed from the beginning. Right? And it's such a beautiful thing to.
In a way of, from what I have learned in worshiping with, well, these are, they're not Eastern Orthodox, though they're Russian and Ukrainian, right, uniate with Rome, and they have a great honoring of the Dormition. They don't call it the Assumption, they call it the Dormition. There's a tremendous devotion for Mary's.
Right, tremendous. Right, and Dormition would be her, in other words, her falling asleep. So Mary, I mean, it's not a dogma of faith, but the tradition of the church is that Mary died. In other words, she chose to share in her son's fate, and since his soul was separated from his body for a time, 3 days in the tomb, Mary, likewise, had her soul separated from her body first before she was assumed into heaven. Right? And so the fact that they celebrate the Dormition, the falling asleep of Mary, isn't in any way incompatible with her then being assumed into heaven. And in Jerusalem, there's an Orthodox church, which is precisely the place where they believe she was assumed into heaven. And they actually found there was a mudslide there, and they did an excavation, and they found a tomb would seem of Our Lady, where she is assumed into heaven. And it's right next to Gethsemane in the Holy Land. There are different traditions, but okay. In Revelation 12, the woman is in travail and anguish. She brought forth a male child to rule the nations. And the question goes, St. Pius X says that was us, but it seems like the text is speaking about Jesus. How can that be reconciled? Because one second. Revelations 12 says, being with child, she cried out in travail, was in the anguish of delivery. And then a few verses later, she brought forth a male child who will rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And that seems to be Jesus, but also the church, because Jesus and the church are inseparable. Right? And the church rules with her head. Right? In other words, Mary, and then at the end, it's clearly the members of the mystical body, the rest of her offspring. Right? Those who keep the commandments of God. The dragon was out to get them. So I want to say that the woman who gives birth to this child in travail is Mary and the church, and the child is Jesus and the church. In other words, Jesus and us. And that makes sense because Christ, the fathers of the church, St. Augustine, loves to speak of the whole Christ. The whole Christ is head and members, the mystical body. And they can't be separated. And so the woman who brings forth this child, right, the child is Jesus and us. Right? We share, and that's why we share in having the same mother, because we're part of the same body. Right? And that's why spiritually Mary is our mother, because we're members of Christ's body. Okay. You mentioned the fact that Adam held the grace given to man, and that Eve's sin alone could not have ruptured man's state of grace. How can it be that Eve, who possessed human dignity equal to that of Adam, did not share in God-given grace. Well, Eve did have both Adam and Eve were created in grace, in the same grace. They were created in the same state of original justice. But of the two, one was the head of that original family. Adam was the head. And that's why Adam's sin had a greater social effect. In other words, it was passed on to us precisely through Adam's consenting to the sin. But Eve had an equal dignity, obviously, with Adam. They're both made in the image of God and with the same image and likeness. In other words, sometimes the fathers see the image as human nature and the likeness being the supernatural gift of grace. So both Adam and Eve were created in both the image and the likeness, nature and grace together. David?
In a homily, I heard a pastor argue that, in fact, Adam's sin was the greater of the two. Because, number one, he should have protected Eve from the allurement of the devil.
Sure, insofar as he's head.
And that he was present there with her. So he should not have allowed her to be. So he not only does he pass on the defect of his leadership to the whole human race, but he also failed his own wife or Eve in that situation.
Yeah, that's good. Another question: If God is constant, by the way, just that one. Obviously, that's a scandal to us today. The idea, first of all, I mean, it's hard, especially Americans, I think, but it's true just of mankind in general. We tend to think of everything in egalitarian terms, right? Everything should be equal, and it's clear that that's not the way God creates. And the reason why it's not the way God creates is because a world in which everything is on the same level wouldn't be beautiful. It wouldn't be a perfect image of God. And that's why when we look out into the natural world, the beauty of the natural world, if you go to the zoo, is the fact that everything isn't the same, right? It would be horrible if you went to the zoo and everything was just the same species of beetle. I mean, the beauty is the hierarchy of it, that each one's different and that there's higher and lower. That's the beauty of nature, that the species are distinct precisely by different imitations of God, and some being higher than others. And that of all of these species, there's a king, and that happens to be man. And again, that's a scandal to the modern mind. We want to eliminate that hierarchy and treat man as no different than the pig or whoever. And I mean, and that's absurd. And even in the angelic world, God didn't make all the angels the same. He made them all different. He made a hierarchy of angels. And one was the highest, and that one was Satan. And it was precisely because of pride in his natural excellence, being the greatest of all God's creatures, that was the probable motive of his fall, of his rebellion. Not wanting to cede that natural excellence to the gratuitousness of grace that could elevate a lower creature above him, like Our Lady and the Church. But in any case, God does everything in hierarchy, and so we should expect everything that he does to be hierarchical. And the church is that way too. The members of the church aren't equal, right? There's a preeminent member, and that's Our Lady. Right? And no one else will ever get the gift of being the mother of God, and being the mother of the church, and being the mother of all mankind. And that shouldn't upset us, right? That would be absurd. What kind of church would it be? That should fill us with joy, that she received this privilege, because it's the privilege of the one is the privilege of all. When you love, that's precisely the beauty of the communion of saints. We touched on it last week. The communion of saints is the fact that all the members share in the privileges of all the other members. And so if God makes higher and complementary but higher members, that's beautiful for me because I can share in that, right? And so the beauty of the church, that there some members that are popes, others that are martyrs, others that are doctors, others that are missionaries. That enriches all. No? And so we shouldn't be surprised when we see that at the very beginning of history as well. That even in the very beginning, there was a hierarchy between Adam and Eve. And it's a hierarchy of mutual complementarity and support, but a distinction of roles. And both roles are necessary. And so we find in the church as well, there's a headship in the church, right? And that headship goes to Christ. And Mary represents the other half. She represents the maternal, the half that Eve, the part that Eve played in the original marriage. Right? She's not the head, and the marrying part of the church isn't the head, but it's pretty important. And so, anyway, that hierarchical element of God's work is hard for us to grasp, but it's so beautiful, right? And it's something that we need to pray to understand. Okay. Another question. If God is constant and abides by the natural law He has ordained, how can the occurrence of divine intervention be explained? In other words, how can miracles be explained? Right? Because at the very beginning I said God is constant and He works the same way always. And we see that even in natural law, which He always follows. Well, the fact is that, there's the saying, the exception proves the rule. That the legislator isn't bound by the laws that he makes, but he's bound by the purpose for which he makes them. Right? So God isn't bound by the natural law that He established in the world, but He's bound by the purpose for which He made those natural laws, which is to make a perfectly ordered universe. Now, in the perfect order of God, the natural law that He's created so that we have an ordered universe, it's fitting that that natural order be very rarely and occasionally suspended. Why? To show a still higher order that is spiritual. Right? And that's what He does. In other words, the very fact that nature is regular allows certain events to be grasped as miraculous. And thus, it allows us to grasp that there's a breakthrough, that God is speaking to mankind. In other words, if God wants to speak to man, He has to get our attention. He has to give us reasons of credibility why we should believe what He tells us and not think that He's a charlatan talking. There was a couple of days ago, there was a story in the news that President-elect Obama had called somebody up on the phone, and the person thought it was a prank and hung up. And it happened twice, and he kept on hanging up. And that's reasonable for mankind to do that. If somebody calls, as it were, and says, "This is God speaking," we should think it's a prank, probably. Usually it is. But if it's really Him speaking, we should expect to see some sign that only He can do. And that's precisely the purpose of miracle. It's to say, this is His voice. Why? Because it's authenticated by something only God can do. Right? And so miracles are very well ordered. If we look at the Gospels, and that's precisely, for example, why we don't believe those child miracles about Jesus. That would have been to no purpose. Totally gratuitous. Just a mere intervention in God's order for no reason. Whereas all the miracles that we see in the Gospel are tremendously ordered. Take this first one that we read about today. The changing of the water into wine. That was so perfectly ordered in every respect. The way it came about through Mary's intercession, what it symbolized, right? The transition from the old covenant to the new wine. The new wine that's better, that's usually given at first, and here it was reserved for the last. Just as the new covenant is better than the old, right? Not through any fault of the old, but because the whole purpose of the old was to culminate in the new. And so we see, and we can go through them all, the miracle of the loaves and fish that Jesus does. Why did He do that? Well, because the next day He was going to teach on the bread of life and teach about the Eucharist. And so the day before, He prepared for His sermon on the bread of life by multiplying the loaves to feed the 5,000. Right? And we see it over and over again, that Jesus' miracles are perfectly ordered and thus perfectly fitting for a God of order. Okay. Faith in the wrong things is credulousness. Eve had faith in the serpent even after she had seen God. You say that Mary drew down Christ from heaven through her faith. She obviously had the right stuff. The world is littered with religions, cults, beliefs, atheism, for example, that embrace a myriad of faiths. What is it that makes a saving faith that calls Christ down from heaven? Is it reason? Is it humility? Please discuss. Great question. It has to include reason and humility, absolutely. And obviously, it has to be motivated by charity. It has to include reason because, just for the same reason that we said just a minute ago, that if God speaks to mankind, we should expect him to identify himself correctly. Why? Because he doesn't want us to... religion is about the most serious things that there are in life. Right? Religion is about the meaning of our lives and our eternal happiness. And therefore, to believe lightly on religious questions is to treat what's most weighty and sacred and grave and important in a way that's not appropriate for what's weighty and grave and important. So if I'm just to believe the first person that comes along, or if I'm to believe even without a miracle concerning my final destiny and the meaning of my life on earth and how to live the good life, that would be to treat God lightly. And so to want motives of credibility is reasonable. And faith is above reason, but it's not contrary to reason. God treats us in a way proper to reasonable creatures. And so the fact is, yes, this world is littered with different faiths and beliefs, but not all of them, not all of them, that only one of them has proper motives of credibility. Proper motives now, only one of them, I don't mean to, there were two. In other words, in all the history of mankind, there have been two revealed religions that together form one faith. The Old Covenant and the New, right? Israel and the Church. And those two are one because it's one revelation. It's one revelation in the beginning, the moving towards fullness, and its fullness. Right? And so God has revealed himself once. And in that one revealing, he used motives of credibility to make his voice known. And those motives of credibility are fundamentally four, the way that I see it. Miracles is the first, that's the most obvious. That's the one most suited for the human condition. And and obviously the miracles performed by Moses were what validated the revelation at Sinai. Right? So that revelation at Sinai was prepared for by the 10 plagues, by the crossing of the Red Sea, by the manna in the desert, the water coming from the rock. Right? Those weren't just arbitrary things suspending God's laws for no reason, but they were there precisely to give authority to the Word of God on Sinai. And then the prophets did miracles all through the life of Israel to show that God was with them. And the Word of God continued to come, also with the second quality, prophecy. Something only God knows are future free events. The devil can't know that. Angels can't even know that unless God reveals it to him. No one can know it except God, because all history is before him. So when somebody gives a prophecy of the future, and it comes to pass, that's a sign that God has spoken. And the Old Testament was validated in this way precisely by its fulfillment in the New. In other words, it's Christ as the Messiah that validates Judaism really more than anything else. I mean, it was already validated by the miracles and other prophecies, but it's above all the fulfillment of the messianic prophecies that shows Judaism to be God's true word. And then, so the third motive of credibility is the social body formed by that religion. That would be Israel and above all the church. And formed precisely in a way contrary to the way that human kingdoms are formed. Human kingdoms are formed by the sword, by economic power, etc., by human means. And we look at the history of the church, it was formed contrary to all of those means. In the first centuries, in the midst of terrible persecution, etc. And we see everywhere, always, that the martyrs are the seeds of future Christians. And it's miraculous in being one, the church, despite the human tendency to division and separation, etc. And then the fourth sign is harder to use. But it would be the sanctity and the sanctity of the doctrine revealed, the sanctity of what God reveals. And obviously, there's no sanctity like that of Christ's life, passion, and paschal mystery for us, right? That manifests at one and the same time the gravity of sin and the love of God for every man. So faith is reasonable. And faith is humility, right? And so it was Mary's humility that called God down, because her faith was the thing that stops us from having faith when God speaks to us is pride. We want to be our own lawgiver, and especially because Revelation all centers on God's plan for mankind. In other words, what's Revelation all about? God's plan for mankind, not my plan. And God's plan means it means the moral law, it means the spiritual life, it means the cross. It means that you get to glory through Calvary. And this is contrary to what we want. This is contrary to pride. And so humility is essential to faith, right? And it was Mary's humility that, we could say, brought Christ down. Right? And that's what she says in her Magnificat, that God looked upon the lowliness of his handmaid. Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, but I'd like to make a comment very briefly. I was thinking about all the Christian churches, notwithstanding all the other religions that might exist in the world. But when you talk about the humility and the pride business, if you go back to the founding of all the Protestant faiths, there was a subtraction somewhere that someone could not accept all of God's.
Right. And generally what that subtraction has to do with is the church. Because it's precisely in the church where we, the church is the mystery. It's Mary. That's why Mary and the church go together. That humility of Mary in, be it done to me according to thy word. That's what the church is all about. It's a submission to God that is not always easy. And that's what heresy, at least, that's what the Protestant Reformation was really most centrally about. The whole idea of private judgment, right? That we should be the arbiters of revelation. And that would be in other words, faith, the Second Vatican Council speaks of faith as a gift of self. It's a gift of self by which we give our minds and hearts to God in obedience to his word, like Mary did. And as in Mary it brought down the incarnation, in us it brings Christ to birth in our hearts. But that requires, that gift of self requires that I submit to a word that's above me. And it's in the church that we have that possibility to submit to a word that comes down to us through the magisterium of the church, which is, anyway, I think on that note we should close. It's getting late.